What if the greatest danger of the human soul is not ignorance? What if a person can know the truth and still refuse it? Because the fall of Satan was not caused by a lack of knowledge. It was caused by arrogance. Ana khayrun minhu. I am better than him. And perhaps that same disease still exists within us today. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to Reflection, where we explore the deeper meanings, insights, and realities revealed in the Qur'an. In the last episode, we explored the unseen, the limits of human perception, the realities that exist beyond what we can immediately observe. But this episode takes us somewhere else entirely, because the story of Iblis is not simply about Satan, it's about arrogance, self-deception, and what happens when ego becomes stronger than submission. As God says in the Qur'an, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse 34, وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ أَبَى وَاسْتَكْبَرَ وَكَانَ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ. And when we say to the angels, prostrate before Adam, they all prostrated except Iblis. He refused, acted arrogantly, and became among the disbelievers. So in this episode of Reflection, we will explore why Iblis refused the command of God, how arrogance can corrupt knowledge, worship, and faith, why Satan's influence is based on deception, not control, and what the story of Iblis reveals about the human soul itself. At first glance, the story seems simple. God commands, Iblis refuses, and because of that refusal, he falls. But the Quran wants us to stop there for a moment, because the frightening part of this story is not that Satan disobeyed. It is that he disobeyed knowingly. He recognized who God was. He was not uncertain, not confused, not searching for evidence. Allah commanded the angels to prostrate before Adam, not as worship, but as obedience to God, as recognition of the station Allah had given to Adam. And every one of them obeyed, except Iblis. As God says in the Qur'an, وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ أَبَى وَاسْتَكْبَرَ وَكَانَ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ. And when we say to the angels, prostrate before Adam, they all prostrated except Iblis. He refused, acted arrogantly, and became among the disbelievers. Notice the language carefully. First, he refused. Then he acted arrogantly. The refusal came from pride, and that changes everything. Because Iblis did not deny God, he rejected submission. And those are not the same thing. A person can believe in truth intellectually while refusing to surrender to it internally. Perhaps that is one of the most dangerous states a soul can reach. To know but refuse, to recognize but resist, to worship but still choose the self over obedience. And this is why the story of Iblis is not merely about Satan. It is about the human condition itself. Because once arrogance enters the soul, truth itself becomes difficult to accept. Not because the truth is weak, but because the ego cannot tolerate surrender. And that is exactly what destroyed Iblis. Not ignorance, pride. Pause for a moment. What if the real danger is not failing to recognize truth, but refusing to bow to it? The Quran does not leave the refusal unexplained. Allah asks Iblis directly, as anchored in Surah Al-A'raf, that is Surah number 7, verse 12. مَا مَنَعَكَ أَلَّا تَسْجُدَ إِذْ أَمَرْتُكَ. What prevented you from prostrating when I commanded you? And the response of Iblis reveals everything. أَنَا خَيْرٌ مِّنْهُ. I am better than him. That sentence is one of the most dangerous sentences in the Quran, because it is the language of arrogance, not ordinary pride, not confidence, not self-worth, but the belief that the self stands above obedience. And Iblis does not stop there. He continues. He tells God, خَلَقْتَنِي مِن نَارٍ وَخَلَقْتَهُ مِن طِينٍ. You created me from fire and you created him from clay. Notice what happened here. Allah had already commanded him. The matter was already decided. But Iblis placed his own judgment above the command of God. He looked at fire, he looked at clay, and he concluded fire is superior. So in his mind, obedience no longer seemed necessary. And this is what arrogance does to the human being. It does not merely produce pride, it corrupts perception itself. A person begins trusting the ego more than truth, desire more than guidance, emotion more than revelation. And slowly, the self becomes an idol. The Qur'an describes the spiritual condition directly in Surah Al-Jathiyah, that is Surah number 45, verse 23. أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهَهُ. Have you seen the one who takes his desires as his God? Not because the human being literally worships himself, but because desire begins replacing submission. That is why arrogance is so spiritually dangerous. Because once the ego becomes dominant, submission begins to feel unbearable. The ego always seeks superiority. And once a person becomes intoxicated with the self, obedience begins to feel humiliating. That is the terrifying part. Because Satan did not fall through weakness. He fell through self-importance. And perhaps that is why arrogance is so destructive. Because an arrogant person does not merely commit mistakes. They justify them. Even after truth becomes clear, sit with that for a moment. The moment a human being places the ego above truth, the path of Iblis begins. One of the most unsettling realities in this story is that Iblis possessed deep awareness of divine reality. Satan did not deny God's existence. He worshipped, he knew, he believed in the day of judgment, and yet he still fell. That should force us to rethink something important, because people often assume that information automatically leads to guidance. But the Qur'an repeatedly shows that information alone is not enough. A person can possess information and still remain spiritually diseased, can speak about truth and still resist transformation, can worship externally while internally serving the ego. The Qur'an describes this terrifying state elsewhere in Surah An-Naml, that is Surah number 27, verse 14. وَجَاهَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُمْ ظُلْمًا وَعُلُوًّا. They rejected them while their souls were convinced of them out of injustice and arrogance. Notice the language carefully. Their souls were already convinced. Internally, they knew, but arrogance prevented surrender. And that is exactly the disease of Iblis. Imam Ali alayhi salam is recorded in Nahj al-Balagh, where he says, فَاعْتَبِرُوا بِمَا كَانَ مِنْ فِعْلِ اللَّهِ بِإِبْلِيسَ إِذْ أَحْبَطَ أَمَلَهُ الطَّوِيلَ وَجَهْدَهُ الْجَهِيدَ. Take a lesson from what Allah did with Iblis. After his long worship and immense effort, all of it was destroyed. The problem was not intellectual, it was spiritual. He did not misunderstand the command. He refused to accept a reality that wounded his ego. And perhaps this is one of the greatest spiritual dangers, to confuse religious knowledge with spiritual surrender, because they are not the same thing. Knowledge is supposed to produce humility, awareness of God, awareness of limitation, awareness of dependence upon the Creator. But when knowledge becomes disconnected from sincerity, it can produce the exact opposite: pride, superiority, self-righteousness. And that is why this story is so dangerous for religious people specifically. Because the closer a person comes to religion, the greater the temptation to admire the self, to feel superior, more righteous, more enlightened, more worthy than others. And the terrifying thing is, those feelings can hide beneath worship itself. A person can pray and still be arrogant, can speak about God and still worship the self internally, can appear religious outwardly while inwardly becoming consumed by pride. That is why the story of Iblis is not simply about disbelief. It's about corruption from within. Pause for a moment. Not every soul that speaks about truth has surrendered to it. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about Satan is imagining that he controls human beings. The Qur'an rejects that idea completely. Iblis cannot force anyone to sin. He cannot override free will. He cannot compel obedience. He cannot seize control of the soul. His power is far more subtle than that, and perhaps far more dangerous, because Satan works through whispers, suggestions, temptation, distortion, even emotional manipulation. He beautifies falsehood. The Qur'an repeatedly describes Satan as making evil appear appealing, and often his whispers become so intertwined with the ego that people begin mistaking them for their own thoughts. That is why the Qur'an repeatedly describes him as al-waswasil khannas, the whisperer who withdraws, as anchored in Surah Nas, that is Surah number 114, verse number 4, where God tells us, al-waswasil khannas, the whisperer who withdraws. His influence is subtle, hidden, and quiet. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because people usually expect evil to appear obviously evil, but Satan rarely approaches human beings through ugliness. He approaches them through justification, through rationalization, through the language of, you deserve this, just this once. And perhaps this is why the Qur'an presents Iblis not merely as a tempter, but as a deceiver, someone who manipulates perception itself. Satan does not force the act. The human being still chooses. And that distinction is critical, because without free will, there can be no moral responsibility. As Allah tells us in the Qur'an in Surah Al-Hijr, that is Surah number 15, verse 42, Inna ibadi laysa laka alayhim sultanun. Indeed, my servants, you have no authority over them. Notice that carefully. No authority, only invitation, only suggestion. And on the day of judgment, Iblis himself will admit this, as anchored in the Qur'an in Surah Ibrahim, that is Surah number 14, verse 22. وَمَا كَانَ لِيَ عَلَيْكُمْ مِنْ سُلْطَانٍ إِلَّا أَنْ دَعَوْتُكُمْ فَاسْتَجَبْتُمْ لِي. I had no authority over you, except that I invited you and you responded to me. That verse is devastating, because it destroys one of humanity's oldest excuses, blaming others for what we willingly choose ourselves. And perhaps that is why the struggle against Satan is ultimately not struggle against an external creature. It is a struggle against the part of ourselves that wants the whisper, that welcomes the temptation, that protects the ego, that prefers desire over truth. Pause for a moment. The greatest danger of Satan may not be his whisper itself, but the part of the soul that wants to hear it. At this point, a deeper question begins to emerge. Why would Allah allow Iblis to exist at all? If Satan misguides human beings, deceives them, tempts them, then why permit his existence? The Qur'an answers this question indirectly through the entire structure of human life itself. Because without the possibility of temptation, there can be no meaningful moral struggle. Without resistance, there can be no spiritual growth. Without the ability to choose wrongly, there can be no sincere obedience. And this is one of the deepest realities in the Quranic view of existence. Iblis becomes part of the test, not as an independent power opposing God, but as a creation operating within divine permission. Not because evil is equal to good, and not because Satan possesses independent power, but because the presence of temptation reveals what already exists within the soul. Arrogance, desire, greed, pride, sincerity, humility, faith. Pressure reveals reality. Trials do not create the soul, they reveal it. And this is where the role of Iblis becomes spiritually significant. His whispers do not create the disease, they expose it. They reveal what the soul is willing to follow. As Allah says in the Qur'an, in Surah Al-Mulk, that is Surah number 67, verse number 2, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. The one who created death and life in order to test which of you is best in deeds. Notice carefully, the Qur'an does not say most deeds, it says best in deeds. Because the test is not merely about action, it is about sincerity, humility, submission, and the purity of intention. And this is why the struggle against Satan ultimately becomes a journey of self-awareness. Because the battle is not only outside us, it is within us. Sit with that for a moment. Sometimes the greatest deception is not being tempted by evil, but believing that our arrogance is righteousness. And the frightening reality is this: that same struggle still exists within every human being. The struggle between humility and ego, between surrender and self-importance, between truth and the desire to place ourselves above it. Because the path of Iblis did not begin with disbelief, it began with pride. And perhaps that is what makes this story so deeply relevant to every one of us. So, what does all of this reveal? The greatest spiritual danger is not always ignorance. Iblis recognized the reality of God. He worshipped God and still fell. And even religious knowledge without sincerity can become arrogance. Satan does not force human beings to sin. He whispers, beautifies his falsehood, distorts perception, but the choice still belongs to us. The real battle is internal. The struggle against Iblis is ultimately a struggle against the ego, against self-importance, self-justification, and the refusal to surrender to truth. And perhaps that is why the story of Iblis is repeated throughout the Qur'an again and again. Because it is not merely the story of Satan. It's a warning about what can happen to any soul when arrogance becomes greater than submission. And in the next episode of Reflection, we ask another unsettling question. If Satan knew God, if he understood the command, if he was given the chance to obey, then why did he still fall? Was Satan simply guilty? Or is there something deeper in the way responsibility works? That is what we'll explore next. If this reflection made you pause, then don't leave it here. Take it further. Like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next week, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.